If you drive through Hope, New Mexico, one of the first things you'll notice is how little of the town is left. There are a few homes, a handful of churches, and a post office that closed down during the pandemic. It's a desolate sight, but zoom out and Hope becomes part of a much larger story.
Over the last 3 years, New Mexico has had more oil production than any other state, and that includes Texas.
New Mexico is missing hundreds of millions of dollars in oil and gas revenue.
1 in 6 residents live below the poverty line, and the average family income is about 20% less than the U.S. median. So one of two things must be true. Either the largest oil boom in recent American history hasn't generated any lasting wealth, or that wealth has gone somewhere that we can't see.
And the truth is, New Mexico hasn't wasted its fortune. In fact, it's saved it. It's saved almost $66 billion. But that leaves an even bigger question. Why has saving $66 billion not created any visible prosperity? Why can't we see any of that wealth when we drive through places like Hope? To understand that, we need to go way back to where it all started. But first, let me tell you what I'm going to paint while I talk, because
I found this photo of a cattle ranch in New Mexico around the area where there's currently a lot of oil drilling, and I like this photo for a lot of reasons. New Mexico's origins were as a cattle ranching region, and we'll get into that history in a second, but I also like it because there's this little decorative windmill here, and I think it's kind of ironic that there's this symbol of renewable energy in one of the most lucrative oil and gas drilling areas in the entire country. There's also that beautiful New Mexico palette of those rich oranges that you get in the earth. That rich earth is complemented with this beautiful, lush lavender sky behind it, and I'm going to spend a lot of time focusing on that sky. Visually, I think this is just a gorgeous painting, and I love the symbolism behind it. Let's dive into the history. When New Mexico entered the Union in 1912, its economy was built largely around sheep and cattle. Back then, oil was not a meaningful part of the state's economy, and New Mexico didn't begin producing oil commercially until 1922, when drillers struck the hogback field in northwestern New Mexico, triggering New Mexico's first oil boom. By the 1970s, the industry had begun to decline. The oil wasn't gone, rather it was becoming harder and more expensive to reach at the time with the technology we had back then, and keep that in mind because that's an important part of the current oil boom. But then, around 2010, a breakthrough took place. Horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing, which are two major technological improvements in the world of oil and gas, basically allowed operators to turn a well sideways and drill horizontally into the thick shale that lines the earth beneath New Mexico. And the results were extraordinary.
Historic and unprecedented times. That's how top state economists are describing New Mexico's latest revenue outlook.
The record $9.6 billion budget.
Because of this boom, New Mexico is now bringing in $36 million a day, and this is happening in a state that has constantly struggled with people living below the poverty line. Which brings us back to the central mystery. Where has all that money gone? To answer that question, I followed one barrel pumped from Eddy County. Eddy County has state trust land, so a private oil company, in this case Mewbourne Oil Company, drilled the well, brought the oil to the surface, and then sold it to suppliers. But that company doesn't own everything beneath it. New Mexico, the state, owns the earth beneath the rigs and everything within that earth, so Mewbourne Oil Company owed the state a royalty, like a percentage of that barrel's worth. So that royalty doesn't get stashed into some big dramatic vault or pocketed into some state official's bank account. Instead, it flows into 3 different public trusts where the money is invested and set aside to grow.
There's a system of public funds that now holds almost $66 billion. One of these, the Early Childhood Education Fund, was opened in 2020 with $300 million, and thanks to this oil and gas money, it now has $11.7 billion.
That's a lot of money being invested into long-term funds. And that leads people to a simple story, like corrupt lawmakers are wasting it on statues or pocketing it for themselves, or private corporations have run off with every dollar. You'll see that this narrative is everywhere. New Mexico did not lose its oil money. Politicians didn't steal it. The money changed form. It went from petroleum beneath the earth to financial assets owned on behalf of the public. Cool. But that actually leaves a much harder question. If New Mexico has invested so much of its oil fortune into public funds, then why has that wealth been so difficult to see in places like Hope? And shouldn't those funds be helping the public? Well, one reason that we don't see this wealth reflected in places like Hope is that it's just not how the oil and gas industry works. So let me explain. Oil can generate enormous revenue without creating enough jobs to raise incomes across an entire state. Like, remember how I mentioned that this windfall came as a result of a new technology, that horizontal drilling? Well, that's because the technological advancement in oil drilling over the past decade has been absolutely mind-blowing. Thanks to automation and AI, oil technology is becoming more productive and it requires less people than ever. One crew can now drill a lot farther than they used to be able to. One well can actually physically reach more oil. This is all great for productivity, but not so great for local economies or people's jobs. This productivity is valuable to a government that taxes production on barrels of oil, but it can lead to a strange outcome. The wells can make the government rich without employing enough people to make the communities within that government rich. So the jobs that do exist, they can pay well, and they often do, and they support contractors and restaurants and housing, everything that you would want in regions where oil is produced. There's another barrier, and that is just straight up time. The extraordinary scale of New Mexico's new windfall is relatively young, like 5 years old, but the problems that this money is being asked to solve are much more systemic. So another way to put that is that New Mexico's public balance sheet became very rich much faster than New Mexico's institutions could become strong. Money does not mean capacity, so let's stick with the example of Hope. New Mexico could approve a new irrigation system for Hope to help revitalize a once thriving farming community. But before anybody receives that system, it must actually be designed, and in practice this means that land must be surveyed and permits must be approved. Engineers must be hired and contractors must bid on whatever it is they need to build. So this same problem applies to education and healthcare and childcare, all things that New Mexico has historically struggled to keep up with. The change that New Mexico expects to see from its oil windfall will never look as dramatic as an oil well producing thousands of barrels a day. The change that New Mexico is after should be measured in decades. But that's a risky approach. Oil is a volatile commodity, and even a $1 change in the price per barrel over the course of a year could lead to a $57 million change in New Mexico's annual revenue. New Mexico faces a precarious battle. On one hand, they need to capitalize on the oil boom while the commodity is strong. But if they set too much aside to save for a rainy day, then New Mexico could balance its budget for decades and still fail to build the institutions that will allow ordinary people to flourish. Which brings us back to Hope. Hope's Facebook page is littered with posts reminiscing on its golden age. Every single post seems to reference someone's grandmother's garden or orchard that has long since dried up. Revitalizing Hope does not mean bringing hope back to some mythological golden age. Prosperity and hope might mean something more modest, like investing in an irrigation system that helps return farmers to the region, or hiring more teachers so that the local school can provide better education to the residents. New Mexico's oil will not change the trajectory that Hope has been on for the past 50 years, but it can offer the residents of Hope newfound optimism about what may happen there, and maybe that's the best way to measure this new oil windfall at all. So where did New Mexico's oil money go? Well, it's in the bank. But now New Mexico faces a much tougher problem, turning a rich government into a prosperous society. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time on Painting the Past.